The pandemic has taught us many things so far, and mainly two very important things about science. First, we need science more than ever in history to understand what's happening and what potentially will happen. Second, we need to understand science, and more specifically, the language of science, usually statistics. And to illustrate this, I will break down a picture that has been shared by Jean-Michel, a researcher who has quite some visibility those days, and explain you why this picture is misleading. So Jean-Michel shared an article and asked on LinkedIn, so explain me this. Well, I'm really glad, Jean-Dominique, to do this right now and explain you and show you really in simple terms that everybody will be able to follow and understand that this picture shows nothing at all, or at least not what the author wants you to see. Basically, that's the more important and stronger the lockdown is, the more death there is in the country. Meaning that lockdowns are inefficient, or even they are even worse than if you do nothing. I will break down for this picture exactly what's wrong in several steps. Let's do this. And you have control of measure what the effect of this So first, let's see what's on this graph. Well, we can see that this graph represents the total number of confirmed deaths per million capita for a selected number of countries, and this total number of deaths, the horizontal bars, is taken at the same stage of the disease per country, the 40th days for each country after the pandemic started in each of those countries. And we'll see later what's the definition of the start of the pandemic in each country later during this video. So we can see those horizontal bars, and there is a color code. And these color codes represent the qualitative approach of the type of confinement. Basically, if it's red, the confinement, the lockdowns, were really restrictive. If it's green, they were not so restrictive. And then the main message is the following. We can see at the top that all the countries who have the larger number of deaths per million capita are the one who imposed stronger lockdown measures. And there is, to highlight this, there is one comparison that's interesting, let's say. They show the difference between Sweden and France. And they argue or try to show the fact that Sweden has low lockdown measures and France has very restrictive measures, but more death. And kind of the message the author tried to convey with this, that, well, lockdown measures are inefficient because countries who have strong lockdowns have more death. This picture and the article linked to this picture aims at makes you believing that actually the stronger the lockdown, the more there are casualties due to the pandemic. Meaning that, and potentially that's what's argued alongside this picture, that the lockdowns have not been useful, or even worse, that they are worse than if you let the pandemic continue and you do nothing. The biggest issue with this graph and this logic is what we call reverse causality. Basically, where the lockdowns are the stronger is usually because you require them because the pandemic has hit the country already more strongly than in other places. So it's more because the pandemic is very strong, you impose a strong lockdown. And due to this reverse causality, you cannot say that it's the opposite. Let me take a very simple example. Let's say your building is burning. You have a fire. And the firefighters arrive and take care of the building and of the fire. They contain the fire. Some flats are destroyed and others just have some damage of water and whatever they use to contain the fire. And it's the same as saying, well, the firefighters are not useful at all because in the place where they put more water, the flats are completely destroyed. They are burned. So the firefighters are useless. Well, it's exactly the same. you put more water or more product or whatever they need to stop the fire where the fire is the stronger. With this logic, you will never say it for a fire. It's the same thing with the pandemic. And you could say think also with the police forces. If you look on a map, the US, anywhere in the world, usually there are more police force in more dangerous areas. Is it because the police force are causing the crime? No, of course not. They are answering to this crime. And that's why there are more police force where there are more crime. Same story, reverse causality. The second thing is that there are many variables differentiating those countries, and you cannot just simply compare them and say, well, this is because of the difference that we observe with casualties is because solely because of the lockdowns measure. This doesn't make sense because those countries are really, really different on many aspects. And omitting those differences is what we call an omitted variable bias. Basically, you have some other factors that are influencing the effect that you are measuring. And that makes that perhaps the effect that you're measuring is not due to the lockdowns, but because of something else. And we can think about many things. Some countries differ with their geography, with their geographical location, with the population density, with the age distribution in the countries. And so that's why they are more or less hit by the virus and not necessarily just because of the lockdown measures. And by omitting those factors, you can do worse actually. And that's what's on the graph. They highlight the difference between Sweden and France. But that's what we call cherry picking or anecdotal evidence. It's just one example, but many things are making this difference between those two countries other than just the lockdown measures. Why the case of Sweden is so different and so unique, and that's why we cannot draw any conclusion by just cherry picking this example. To study the case of Sweden, let me use a presentation done by Dimitrija Kalanoski, a senior researcher and colleague of mine at the University of Lausanne. Basically, the strategy of Sweden is focused on social responsibility and relying on the high trust in the government. They expected that the people would follow the rule very well. And what exactly did Sweden do? Well, at the beginning of March, they restricted flights from specific province in China, and then China, Iran, Hong Kong, and Macau. So region who were hit early by the virus. Then, mid-March, they limited the freedom of assembly to 500 people, and then they stopped travel from non-EU member states. After that, they kept restaurants and bars open but imposed a social distance within those places with a limitation of the number of people, more tables, and space between those. And at the end of March, they banned gathering of more than 50%, still more than in Switzerland. And furthermore, they advised sensitive persons to limit their contact. The second thing is that Sweden managed to keep the population in the south and not limiting them to travel in the north for their vacation. And all the hospitals, the airports are located in the south, helping to manage better the number of cases, as we can see on the map. Finally, even if Sweden has not very strict lockdown measure towards the outside, towards other countries, well, neighboring countries from Sweden took more severe measure. And basically, if your neighbors are locked down, well, indirectly, your border are also locked. Last comment, interestingly, if we look at the sample of countries around Sweden, well, the picture is quite the opposite of the graph subject of this video, right? If you look at the countries who have less severe measure, they have more death. But again, this is just correlation and does not allow to conclude anything. The last point is with respect to the logic, what's behind of this graph. Basically, they define a certain threshold to say this is the start of the pandemic in each country, and then they look at 40 days arbitrarily after this threshold. They do not look at how long after the measure was taken they are looking. And as those non-pharmaceutical measures, so those lockdowns, most certainly will take times to show an effect. And this for several reasons, but just think with a very simple logic. Basically, we know that when you are infected by the virus, you have an incubation time where you don't see any symptoms, and it might be up to 2 weeks or more, on average between, let's say, around 10 days. So even if the measure is put on day 1, then you have approximately 10 days before with people getting sick and maybe being in contact with other people. And then you have to get symptoms. The symptoms have to get worse. You have to experience complications to end up in the ICU and eventually die to see this effect on those data, because they are not looking at the number of people who are infected, but the number of deaths. So incubation time, complications, going in the ICU, eventually dying. This represents an important delay between the moment you define, you take the measure and you observe anything happening. And in this time span of 40 days, even if the measure was taken on the first day, it's not sure that we will see the effects. But maybe the measures were taken on day 39 or day 20. And on average, it's important to note that the countries, and this is based on a sample of 184 countries, the measure were taken between 30 and 35 days, depending on which measure you are looking, on average, after the first case was reported in each country. So countries took on average a month to start implementing the first measure after the first case was reported. So clearly there is first a delay between the implementation of the measure and then before we see an effect. And that's also a reason why we see this raw correlation here that is counterintuitive. So I really hope that this video has been useful to help you better understand those links and help you to be more aware in future situations of those issues of reverse causality, anecdotal evidence, or omitted variable bias, and to ask you deeper questions when you see a graph than just trying to look what the author wants you to believe. And this is the first video of a series that I will do about first aid statistics. Because in this world that we are living now, I deeply think that we have to understand statistics to prevent us from being manipulated and properly understand research and the statistics that we are seeing. And as you have seen, you don't need to do a PhD in statistics to understand that, but just understanding the mechanism will be more than enough to question what you are seeing. In the following video, I will explain how to properly assess the effect of the lockdowns on the spread of the virus. I hope you enjoyed this video. Click the bell button and subscribe button if you want to be alerted of the next videos, and thanks for watching.